Hello and welcome to another An Old Man Watches, and the movie we're going to talk about today is The Assassin Next Door from 2009. It is an Israeli film, I believe, originally, and it tells the tale of Galia, a Ukrainian woman who is duped by a modern slavery ring and tricked into going to a foreign country where they attempt to pressure her into prostitution. Her refusal to kind of bow down to this wins her an unlikely reprieve when her handler offers her the choice of becoming an assassin instead, so kill people rather than have sex with them. She agrees to this, and ultimately, after several years of killing people for money, she's allowed by the mob to sort of have her own apartment and a modicum of sort of personal autonomy. This leads to her befriending the young woman who lives next door, and possibly becoming more than friends with her. But she becomes aware that the woman's husband is abusive, and the mob is not interested in letting her do anything about this because it would draw attention to her, it would draw attention to them. But she's not kind of the person to idly stand by. That's basically what the movie's plot line is. So what's interesting to talk about with it? What does it do right? What does it do wrong? What's just interesting or worth talking about? Well, first of all, the title of this movie, The Assassin Next Door, and even the tagline, Beware of Thy Neighbour, made me expect something sort of tonally in the style of something like The Whole Nine Yards or Mr. and Mrs. Smith, a movie where people die, absolutely, but the tone is still fairly light-hearted. That is not this movie. This is a pretty grim film with some themes that we'll talk about in a moment that are not fun, and it is not a particularly upbeat or light movie. The original title is something like Kurat, which does not translate to The Assassin Next Door. This, I think, is very much a case of them slapping a new title on it for an international market that is not necessarily well judged, shall we say. So this is, I still enjoyed the movie, but it was not the movie that I expected based on the title. The second thing, having mentioned there are some pretty grim themes in this film. So content warning on this one. It features sexual exploitation, spousal abuse, and misogyny of all kinds. I am pleased to say that I didn't find any of those elements of the movie to be sensationalized or glamorized. Unlike, say, a movie like The Wolf of Wall Street, which features a huge amount of misogyny, but has an unfortunate tendency to glamorize that misogyny and make it look cool. This is not a movie that does that, but it's still, it's a confronting film. With some confronting themes worth calling out, I think. Finally, I want to discuss the question of empowerment, because this movie, does kind of deal with that question. We've got Galia, and she refuses to be a prostitute, and she's offered a deal where she can become an assassin instead. And you might think, well, that's she's won a concession, a reprieve. She's but and she has. But at the same time, despite her job and despite the fact that she's a killer and a potentially dangerous person, she doesn't really have power in her life. When you're allowed to live in your own apartment is kind of like a big concession. You don't have a lot of power. You don't have a lot of agency in your own life. And the movie, and obviously her neighbor, who is living in an abusive relationship, also doesn't have a lot of power in her own life. And so this is a movie that is ultimately looking at that question of empowerment and how do you get agency in your life, trained killer or not, Galia doesn't have much agency. She doesn't have much power. And this movie explores her attempt to take agency and power for herself and for her neighbor. It doesn't, there are other movies obviously that talk about themes like this. I'm thinking of things like Thelma and Louise, for instance. And I feel like Thelma and Louise probably, feel like, even despite the way that movie ends, they choose their ending, and they have more. I feel like they feel more empowered throughout that movie than necessarily Gallia does, even at the end of this movie. But this is definitely a movie about her trying to seize some power and some control over her life, because she's reached a point where the concessions that she's made in order to avoid the concessions that she completely refused to make become too much, and she has to take another step to try and get that agency and control for her own life back. So it's kind of some heavy themes in this movie, and obviously some unpleasant elements to it. And like I said, not at all the movie I expected based on the title, based on the kind of glamorous woman with a gun on the cover kind of marketing that this film had. It's not at all kind of the movie that necessarily you might expect of it. It's a good movie. I enjoyed it. I'm glad I saw it. But not well named, I don't think. But yeah, that's The Assassin Next Door. That's what I thought was interesting to talk about in regards to it. Next time, I'm going to talk about 1934 movie/serial called The Lost Jungle. I'm reviewing the movie version. So in the 1930s, there was a thing that happened where they would make a multi-part serial and then they would turn it into a shorter film as well. I'll be reviewing the movie version of this. So that'll be next time. In the meantime, I hope you enjoyed this one, and I will catch you next time.